authority to actually drop the breach proceeding. So it's a good result for the clients, and it was an interesting case. I don't know where I am on the 10 to 12 minutes.
That's interesting, thank you. Okay, so we'll take questions afterwards. So, John, would you like to?
Thank you. Yeah, I came close to being an expert witness. That's the best I can say. Where I got rung up by someone who was a defence lawyer for someone called Simon Bikindi. I'd never heard of Simon Bikindi. Turns out that Simon Bikindi was on trial for war crimes, genocide, because he was a songwriter whom had been identified by the Rwandan war crimes trials as having his songs used to inspire the genocide. And the reason I was called was, I think rather desperately, must have been desperately, to find someone who would say, well, no, songs can't do this. You can't say that a song or a songwriter is responsible for actions of a horrendous kind like took place during the Rwandan genocide. In fact, what's interesting with that case, Simon Bikindi ended up in prison for war crimes, but the crime for which he was prosecuted was not the songs he'd written, but the speeches he'd given, which he'd incited riots and violence to take place. But the court itself ruled that it was perfectly conceivable that the songs that he had composed could have that effect. In other words, songs could make people act violently. And the thought that this inspires, which I think relates to exactly what Karen was saying and others, that what happens in public spaces involving musicians can have effects which require them to be policed. That's the argument that I'm looking at. I mean, I'm talking too about public spaces and what is done with those public spaces where musicians and music is being performed, and the extent to which those acts constitute, in this case, a targeting of particular players, particular kinds of music, namely rap. So, what I'm doing is just a very brief sketch of the kind of vague thoughts that I have about what might be playing into this story about how live performances of music are criminalised and racialised. Now, the example, these thoughts are inspired by two things. I read in a debate, which I few of you will have bothered with, which took place in the House of Lords over the Licensing Act of 2000 and something, 8-9 I think it was, in which Lord Reesdale, about whom you may never hear anything more, said, I believe that it is a human right to perform or to hear unamplified music in a live venue. It was a human right to hear live music. And that struck me as a really interesting thing to be saying. Now, actually, turns out he's a Morris dancer, and what he means by live music may be rather different from what Snoop Dogg thinks about live music. Anyway, but so here was someone saying that live music was a human right. At the same time, in exactly the same year that he made that, which was 2011, the grime artist, Jonathan was talking about earlier, Giggs, had, in 2010, an entire tour cancelled, and in 2011, a subsequent tour cancelled. Both, it seems, on the instigation of the Metropolitan Police, who identified Giggs as a dangerous person because he had a previous conviction for gun crime, and who was thereby seen as being a focus for crime and violence at the gigs. The police went so far as to phone record companies who were inclined to sign Giggs to say they shouldn't sign him as well. Goes back to some of the things we were talking about earlier this morning. So he was someone whose right to perform his music, he relatively successful, his mixtapes apparently sold 100,000. He was someone whose music was being denied a public venue, a public performance, in the name of the possible violence that may occur as a result of it, and was being instigated by the police. So here we have these two kind of, the human right to live performance and these abuses of it. And what then made me think, what kind of arguments, what kind of practices might either allow for or deny the idea of live music as a human right? And what happens when live music is performed, and what does the state do to try and regulate it, and to what extent is it in breach of human rights or respecting of. Now, what I then looked at was a wonderful book by a New York lawyer called Paul Schiavini, who took a case through several layers of the American judicial system, legal system, about the right to perform music live in New York. This is, I think, in the 50s and 60s, there's a restriction that says only 3 musicians may be allowed on stage in certain venues. Now, this was allegedly health and safety, although, of course, what it did was to, as it subsequently turned out, it prohibited the performance of certain kinds of music. Because if you've only got 3 musicians, there are certain kinds of musical forms that don't work in that context. And what happened was that Schiavini, through the courts, established that actually this was a breach of the First Amendment. That the non-performance, the restriction on having 3 musicians was a restriction on the right of people to express themselves in a particular way, in particular vernacular musics, as the court was to say, because there weren't enough musicians allowed to perform it. And so this was a free speech claim made about the performance, not about the lyrics, not about what was written down, but what happened when it was performed. And that struck me as a really interesting example of how, as it were, human rights can be, as it were, understood to be expressed through the performance of music and the use of a public space for that performance. And it wasn't then about the lyrics, it was about an entire mode of expressing it. Okay, so so back to the UK, and the question of whether those, if we look at the history of how live music has been treated in this country, is that an example of, as it were, a systematic restriction of rights and, as I say, with discriminatory biases enacted within it? And I'm just going to give you a very brief sketch of moments in the history of popular music's live performance and its restriction. The first of which comes in 1914. In the UK, we passed something called the Aliens Restriction Act. 1914, the start of the First World War. It's designed to provide for national security. This is used by the British Musicians Union, it's called something different at the time, to prevent foreign musicians playing in this country. These foreign musicians turn out mostly to be black jazz musicians from the United States. And this law, this act is used throughout the interwar period by the Musicians Union. And what's interesting is that even in its own official history, the Musicians Union's historian reports that this was used largely, and I quote, as a means of xenophobic, racist and anti-Semitic sentiment to prevent musicians from other countries playing here, but it was argued for very particular racial reasons. Now, other subsequent historians have come around and said, well, actually, that's not necessarily the case. There were other arguments, the labour rights arguments and so forth that were going on. But for the most part, the Musicians Union was the major force restricting the performance of foreign musicians in this country, and as I say, many of whom were coming out of jazz and other such musics. What's interesting is that until Mrs. Thatcher comes into power in 1979, the Musicians Union is no longer consulted by the authorities on who should play in this country. So neoliberalism has something for it, okay? Possibly. 1950s in Britain, concerts are banned because of dancing in the aisles. Particularly, there's kind of conflict between health and safety rules, which say we need to keep the aisles free, and Rock Around the Clock and the other films which people listen to, are watching, or performances by rock and roll artists, in which they're encouraged to dance. And dance, and the public use of spaces for dancing, becomes this issue between health and safety and dance. And the politics of it here are about licensing laws, police regulation, and local authorities. And the state, at the national level, doesn't seem to be greatly involved. And what's interesting, though, in the 1950s, this becomes quite an issue, who could be performing where and so forth. In the 1960s, the free festivals, you'd think the state would then start thinking, hold it, we can't have these people having free festivals all over the place. And in fact, it does set up an inquiry to ask whether free festivals should be allowed and should be regulated. And interestingly, decides not to prosecute free festivals, not to regulate them any more than they are, on the grounds it would be politically unpopular. So it's not always the case that the state's actions in this respect, but of course, those free festivals are made up of a particular kind of music and run by a particular group of people. Punk in the 1970s becomes another important focus for the regulation of live performance. The Sex Pistols' first tour is banned following their appearance on the Today Show on, it must be in Granada, in Manchester, in which they swear and so on. I think it was anyway. They swear, and I'm ashamed to say my university is the first to cancel the subsequent tour. The first night was to be at the University of East Anglia. It doesn't happen. There's a wonderful document in the archives of my university where they note that the Sex Pistols have been allowed to perform at Leeds Polytechnic. And someone's written in the margin, that's the end of Leeds Polytechnic as a serious academic institution. But what's interesting here is that it's actually universities worried about their reputation who are deciding that the Sex Pistols can't perform. What's also happening, in the same year that Sex Pistols are banned, is the Mighty Diamonds, the reggae band, are banned by the Hammersmith Odeon. The Hammersmith Odeon does not just ban the Mighty Diamonds, they ban all reggae acts. And in their justification of it, they say they are worried about the music and its followers might antagonise local residents, the general public, the police and local authorities. And that theme is reiterated in the 1990s when the policing of dance music takes place. And the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act of 1994, which specifies what we mean by repetitive beats, a wonderful piece of legislative imagination, also, as its justification for why dance music should be legislated for, is it causes serious distress to the inhabitants of the locality. And so what's interesting here is the ways in which local residents are used as an excuse or a reason for the licensing laws that then restrict certain forms of music. And then we come on, finally, and back to gigs, and the ban on him and his tour, and the latest one, which was Tyler, the Creator. I should also mention, by the way, that the Chinese authorities banned Bon Jovi, but we'll assume that was for good taste, rather than... But what's interesting... Sorry. But, I mean, Tyler, the Creator has just been banned by the Home Office. Prior to that, Snoop Dogg has been banned. And there have been serious bans on ragga artists from Jamaica and elsewhere. Typically, the reasoning here is not explicit. Or the Home Office statement about why Tyler, the Creator, was not to perform is coming to the US. This is the Home Office announcement. Sorry, I'm going to stop. Coming to the UK is a privilege, and we expect those who come here to respect our shared values. The Home Secretary has the power to exclude an individual if she considers that his or her presence in the UK is not conducive to the public good, or if the exclusion is justified on public policy grounds. And there's no further reference to what the reasons are, except journalistic accounts claim that Tyler, the Creator, received a letter explaining that it was that his lyrics encourage violence, intolerance, and homophobia. And indeed, there was some reference to terrorism, but I'm not sure that's a reliable source. Interestingly, he was also banned from Australia. But the reasons that he was banned from Australia, allegedly, is that actually this was pressure from a feminist group who wanted him to be denied a visa on the grounds that his lyrics promote domestic violence. And violence against women. In other words, we come back to this question of how it is and to what reasoning and who's involved in the policing of space, in which it seems to me there are very strongly racial themes running through it, but there are also other actors and other interests and codes for that restriction at play. But I've said enough. Thank you.
Thank you. We can thank both speakers. Thank you.